So let's go through this, the virtual interviews, all right? So most everything in a virtual interview is the same as the old first round interviews. Now I want to be careful because I know a lot of the big four, and I think there are a couple national firms. Show of hands, has anyone done one of those pre-recorded interviews where you just kind of speak into a screen? Yeah. So I apologize because this really isn't that. I've never done one of those before. I sympathize. I think it's probably pretty hard. But this is more so geared towards like a Zoom interview or a live video interview. All right. There are a few things that are different. So I'll cover that and then I'll wrap it up with some questions. So for those of you who know me or have seen a presentation before, I typically like to keep them pretty short. I think I have PTSD from being in college and going through just awful PowerPoint presentations from professors that were just super boring. So I'm not going to make this very long. I want to turn it over to questions that you guys may have, hopefully that Carlos and I can answer. All right. So most things are the same. The interview timeline is the same. What firms are looking for is the same. The interviewer expectations are the same. And the preparation and follow-up is the same. All right. So we're going to knock through each one of these. So your timeline. How many of you remember, just show of hands, how many of you remember that the first part of an interview? Hi, how are you? Good. How are you? How's your day? Good. Oh, the weather outside. Oh, the traffic's real bad, right? There's this like small talk portion of the interview that's supposed to be rapport building. Honest show of hands, how many of you, when you sit down for an interview, are nervous? I am. The whole concept behind this rapport building part of the interview is that it's meant to put you in a spot where you're not as nervous. Think of it as if it was really just a test of 10 multiple choice questions, the first two are like freebies, like what is your name? How are you doing today, right? These are meant to be, this portion of the interview is meant to put you at ease and make you comfortable. Great time to ask super easy questions. Hey, interviewer, nice to meet you, or good to see you again, or hey, did you go to CSUN? Oh, really? No way. So did I. Like, I'm at CSUN right now. Like, I wonder if we had any of the same professors, right? There's some small talk in the beginning of the interview structurally that's supposed to put you at ease. The middle portion of the interview is all the substance. And then there's the conclusion of that's where they're going to tell you about the next steps, the follow-up, the things that come at the end. But this kind of like flow of the interview is exactly the same as it was before. So there's no difference there whether it's online or not, right? Except now, actually, if you really want to be a smartass, and I would love this, if someone asks like, how's it going? You can say, you know what? I was almost late to the meeting. Traffic was really bad today. Right? But that's because I like corny bad jokes. So what are firms looking for? Pretty much the same thing. Specific skills, grades, your resume, your cultural fit, your personality. Now remember, if you're in the first round interview, you have already passed one screen in terms of either your resume, your grades, any of these things that they're looking for. They're now putting you through an additional screen to compare you with other candidates to really this part of your interview, the grades and the resume, are going to be largely left behind. At this point, it's going to be really about these specific skills. Even the cultural fit and the personality, a lot of that's already been screened for. So really in these interviews, these behavioral interviews, they're really going to zone in on specific skills. All right. This, I want you guys to memorize this. Many of you have heard me say this before. I don't have accounting experience, or I don't have you all have life experience. You all have learned skills from that life experience. Your goal is to connect your experience to your skills to what they're looking for. And what you should be doing, if you've prepared properly for the interview, and we'll get to that in a bit, you should know what skills they are looking for from their job posting. So you're not guessing at what skills they're looking for. So the preparation and the practice is all about tying your life experience, whether it's working at Chipotle or whether it's working at an insurance company or whatever part-time job you may have had. It's all about connecting your experience with the skills that you have, right? The interviewer expectations. Be on time. I know this is a silly one, but for Zoom, I would recommend being about 2 to 3 minutes early. You don't want to be like 5 or 10 minutes early. That's too early in Zoom settings. 2 to 3 minutes before the actual Zoom thing comes on is good. Make sure you're presentable. Now, I get a lot of questions about, how many of you guys have gotten questions about attire for Zoom interviews? Okay, a couple out there. So it's just this box, right? So everything that you're seeing here, I want you to see. Even down to the guitars that are hanging on the wall, the map that's behind me, what I'm wearing kind of attire wise. Like, to be very honest with you, I'm in sandals and shorts outside of the screen, but I do have a collared shirt on, right? I expect many of you are the same. It's the weekend, it's a Saturday, I'm relaxed. But even if it was during the weekday, if I'm at home, like, yeah, you can see I'm in a collared shirt. I've combed my hair. That's basically the baseline expectation for being presentable in the interview, right? If you want to wear a suit and tie, that's cool. It's actually kind of fun. I've had a few students that did that for interviews where, I kind of missed the like real meet the firms or like doing these things in person where you would have to do that. So it's kind of fun if you want. Just make sure that in an interview you're presentable. And that's just comb your hair, wear a shirt with a collar on it. Very simple, right? Make sure your audio and visual equipment is working. Every single one of us has had technical difficulties of one form or another at some point. It happens. I know it happens. But if it happens during your interview, you're gonna feel your heart start to beat a little bit faster, and you're gonna feel a little bit more anxious about something not working, right? Do yourself a favor and test this stuff before you come in. Be prepared for the interview. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But there is an expectation from the interviewer that you are prepared for this interview. You know something about the firm. You know something about the skills that they're looking for because of their job posting. You know your own experiences because you've practiced before telling your own stories, so that when they ask you about that time that you had to meet a deadline, that you have a story ready to go for that because you've practiced, not memorized a script, but prepared your own story. And being engaged. And I think being engaged is one of the hardest things, because if you're when we're in these rooms and we don't have people around us, it's hard to generate the energy just kind of through a camera lens and working through a screen, right? So like trying to show that you're enthusiastic and engaged and interested becomes a little bit harder in the Zoom setting, but it's still the interviewer expectation that you are engaged is still the same. Okay, what to do before and after. This is kind of the same as it was before, right? Before your interview, reach out to your contact at that firm that you're interviewing with and ask if they know what the interview format is. They may not. They might though, right? The recruiter might know, any of the professionals might know. Ask about any information you can get about the interviewer or about what the interview process is going to be like, or you can ask these questions. Now, don't pester the firm professionals or the recruiter, but you can ask for this stuff and sometimes they will actually answer you. And any of that knowledge ahead of time helps you prepare and it helps you practice, right? And many of you have heard me say this before, practice telling stories. What we want to hear as an interviewer is a story about your experience that comes to life, that tells us about whatever experience you've had, that clearly demonstrates that you learned a certain skill that we know will be useful in public accounting, right? Afterwards, this is pretty simple. Email thank you, right? Got to do it. It's a simple part of it. Don't forget to do it. And you can follow up at some point. If it's been, in your email thank you or at the end of the interview, you can ask, hey, when can I expect to hear from you? Would you mind if I reached out if I don't hear back within a week or within 10 days or whatever they tell you, right? So that's in the interview, but then after the interview, make sure you do actually follow up with them to touch base on it, right? It's a little sensitive, right? Because you don't know if you're bothering them or if you've been selected for a second round interview or not. So in that email, thank them for the time. Initially, a day of or day after is great. But then, yeah, make sure you send that email thank you. Don't wait a week to send that, by the way. Send it within 48 hours, okay? Following up to just check on the status. If you don't hear back from the firm within the time they told you, just reach out to the recruiter with kind of a soft, like, hey, just, Garrett mentioned in the interview that you guys would be following up within a week. Just wanted to reach out to make sure, or reach out to see if you needed any other information from me. All right. So in review, the interview timeline's the same. What firms are looking for is the same. The interviewer expectations are the same, and the preparation follow-up is the same. Got it? You see it, guys? So most of this stuff is the same, right? You've heard this stuff before. Those of you who have done an interview know this is pretty much what we've been working with before. This is to set your mind at ease that most everything is the same, which means here's our pivot, right? Here are the things that are not the same. Your energy level and enthusiasm. This is harder in a virtual interview. Where you're looking is totally different now than it used to be, right? Are you looking in the camera? Are you looking on the screen at the person who's interviewing you, or are you looking off the screen, right? Like if I have my notes over, if you ask me a question here and I'm like, well, gosh, Caroline, thank you so much for answering that question. So my experience has been, I started like, you can tell if I'm not looking at the camera, right? It's very easy to tell that, but you wouldn't be able to do that in a real interview, right? So your surroundings are different and they should be a little bit more comfortable in Zoom setting. To be honest with you, I feel very comfortable speaking to you guys today, knowing that I'm in the comforts of my own home with familiar things around me and a chair that I am comfortable in, being able to go to my kitchen to get a glass of water whenever I want. Like I feel very comfortable being at home. And I actually think that's a strength for you guys. And I'll show you something that I think you might laugh at in a bit here with that. So the energy and enthusiasm are oftentimes difficult to convey through a camera, right? It's hard to do this. And again, for those of you who've heard me say this before, I have a newfound respect for news anchors and anyone who works on camera and television. It's awfully tough to convey energy and enthusiasm that's not just phony and full of shit, to be quite honest with you, right? So a lot of it is genuine enthusiasm through a screen is very tough to do, but you've got to do your best to be interested, active, and engaged, right? Where you're looking. So you've really got three things in where you're looking nowadays, right? Typo, your wealth, disco snouts, if any of you guys watch the Geico commercials. So where you're looking, are you looking at the camera? Are you looking at the person who's talking to you on the screen? Or are you looking at, in this case, your wealth? I thought it was interesting that in a lot of these Zoom calls, you end up looking at yourself because you can, right? In real life, you would never look at yourself because you don't have that option. But now that we do, it's kind of weird. Am I in frame? Does my hair look good? Is my shirt all in the right position? Like, it's very strange to do this now, and that's totally different than what we used to have, right? So this is what I'm talking about in terms of being comfortable. Where would you guys rather be? Like if you're at home doing this Zoom interview, I think that's great. It's really comfortable for me. You remember, for those of you who remember the EY Career Center for the interview rooms, this is actually luxurious compared to what you guys are used to at CSUN for those interview rooms, right? They're really small. Would you guys rather be in a room that's like this, sitting that close with a recruiter right now? Like that's nerve-wracking. So enjoy being a little bit more confident in your home surroundings than being in an interview room like this, right? So remember the things that are different, the energy level, enthusiasm, where you're looking and the surroundings, that's a different story, right? So everything in review, most things are the same. There are a few things that are different. And now I wanted to take some questions. So here's Carlos's contact information. Here's my contact information as well. If you guys want to take a screenshot of this, email us any questions you may have. If you're uncomfortable asking questions kind of either through the Zoom or over the chat, feel free to send either one of us questions and we'll do our best to answer them. All right, so I'm going to leave this up for another couple seconds, but then I want to turn this over for what we have until about 11:10. So 15, 20 minutes worth of questions. If you guys have any, would be more than happy to answer any and all. All right. In the chat. Okay. All right. If you have questions, just belt them out or type them in the chat. And if nobody has any questions, you guys can have a little bit of time before lunch, right?
Yeah, I can go ahead and start, Garrett. So one question that I do have is, during the interview, sometimes like we'll have like the opportunity to ask questions. Like I remember when I was doing interviews, I remember I sat down with like the manager and they just asked me like, okay, what do you want to know? And they didn't ask me any questions. So like, what do you, I mean, for me at that moment, I was not really prepared at that point. I just had to like, just pull things out. Like I would just ask them basic questions like, oh, like I see that you're a manager, like what service line are you in? But like what kind of questions do you recommend asking like in those situations? Because sometimes like it can throw us up on a loop. And I feel like for me, I wish I would have known like how to deal with that because I had no clue that that was gonna be thrown at me. I was just like practicing like other questions. But
Yeah.
what do you think?
So that's a great that in and of itself is a good question. That's panic mode, right? Like you've prepared to answer all these questions, and you could ask something where it's like, oh shit. I may have one or two questions that I prepared, but it was certainly for the end of the interview as like wrap up stuff. Because one of them I always love asking is quite simple: are you happy? But coming out of the gates in an interview with a question that's "are you happy?" like that doesn't fit there, right? That doesn't work there. My general MO when that happens is I'm a very chronological thinker, and I think a lot of you have heard me say this. I basically start at the beginning. Where'd you go to high school? I assume you didn't want to be a CPA, Mr. Interviewer, or Ms. Interviewer. I assume you did not want to be a CPA when you were in high school. How did that kind of change, right? Like what happened along the way to getting that person's story? And you can even kind of say like, look, I understand a lot of this business is just about, is about people, right? And so if one of your ways of getting to know people is tell me your story, tell me what's interesting about that. Like I want to learn more about your story to see if I see any similarities for my own story with yours. So that's one place I would go. If out of the gate, someone just asked me like, hey, what questions do you have for me? Right? You might ask like, depending on the size of the firm, hey, like growth is really important to me. Does the firm have any plans for expansion? Right? Maybe at a smaller firm, that's a good question. Maybe for like Deloitte or PwC, maybe not. Like, you serious? We're already pretty big, right? Where do you see the future of like? We always hear things about this changing environment of the accounting industry. In your career, what have you seen change from when you started till now? And then where do you think it's going to go from now, for the next 10 years or the next 5 years or whatever, right? Carlos, any thoughts on that? Because I would be nervous if someone just out of the gate was just sort of like, you've never done that in an interview though, have you?
Not at the beginning. It's always at the end. I always to end an interview because I would like, as much as we're interviewing us or we're interviewing you, you're interviewing us. So I always like to ask, what questions do you have for me? Like, questions you could ask are, what are the expectations of me as an entry-level staff? Or if you are going for an intern position, you can ask, another question would be, what are the hours that are expected? Or will I have anybody to assist me as I'm starting out? Am I assigned a mentor? That was another good question that you could ask. You can ask about the work culture, right? Because at the end of the day, you're going to leave this interview and you kind of want to have an idea of where you're going to work. So those are always some questions that you kind of could want to, ask that right off the top of your head, you should be able to ask like, what do you expect of me? What's the work life there? Work-life balance? What kind of support will I have? Those are all good questions to ask as well.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Oh,
one of them
Garrett.
I've heard that I did like, by the way, was I always, towards the end of an interview, I'll ask, are you happy? Right? Because at the end of the day, for everyone, that's one of the things I care about. If you're unhappy, what are you doing to fix the fact that you are unhappy? Right? Like, this life is too short to be unhappy. The other one that I like, the one that's like, if you could describe your firm in like one word or 3 words or whatever it is, I'm curious to see what other firms would say on that. Because I think that's just kind of a cute, fun one that's kind of fluffy to ask. That's like, it's either a throwaway or it is really meaningful. It just sort of depends on how that person answers that question. But yeah, that's good. These, come prepared with some questions. But yeah, I would feel very nervous if the interview started with just like, all right, open-ended, what do you want to know? And it's like, ooh, hang on. Right?
Right. Also,
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
No, okay. I was just gonna ask another follow-up question, from that. Basically, so like, let's say that the interviewer, like during the interview, like we're asking the questions and stuff. But what are your thoughts on like the interviewee writing down like the answers to those questions, like taking notes during the interview? Is that kind of bad, or is that because like I know that now that we're in like a virtual setting, like you're taking your eyes off the camera when you're like writing down notes and stuff, which I feel like can be a little rude. I don't know, for me on my end, if I was an interviewer, I feel like that'd be kind of rude, you know. But what are your thoughts on that?
I'll be honest with you. I don't know. Obviously, the interviewer is writing things down, right? I don't know if the interviewer feels like their power is threatened if you start writing stuff down, or it's just sort of like, hey, no, I do the writing. You don't do the writing. Like, I'm not entirely like, if you're trying to remember certain stuff, you could always ask too at the start of the interview, like, hey, I want to write down some of the like, do you mind if I take a couple of notes during our interview? Like, I'm not going to take extensive. Where an interviewer will get upset is if it feels like the entire interview was you transcribing and writing things down. If a few times during the interview you write something down to remember it, you could even say, do you mind if I write that down? I want to remember it. Or, oh, I really like that. Do you mind if I write that down to remember it? Like, I think that's a little bit more respectful than just like kind of like for a whole interview, just head down, like taking notes. I think that's probably not a great idea. But yeah, it's kind of funny, right? Because like the interview doing it, like, of course they're writing notes down, they're evaluating you, right? But if you were to do the same thing, they would just be like, it's a little different. We had a chat, one of the chat questions was, what is the best way for students to have a good flow and to not sound so robotic or so rehearsed? Yeah, this is an interesting one to me, because if you remember, I did stress preparing for the interview, but not necessarily, you don't want a script. You don't want to write down a script where you're just, because if you get disrupted in the memorization of that, it's really hard to kind of come back and get back on track. So that's where we talk about practicing in terms of knowing your own story and knowing your own information. Like, how do I say, like, you guys know your own lives pretty well, right? Like, you don't need to write out a script for your own. If you ask me about my experiences in like middle school, I could probably still tell you about them in enough detail that's mildly entertaining, right? Now, obviously, if you ask me about stuff from high school or college, it's going to be fresher on the mind than the further back you go. But you guys should have a pretty good feel for your own life and your own stories. So one of the ways to not sound robotic or rehearsed is to just tell them about your life. You do practice these stories because, if a quick aside, if you think about your friends and your family in normal life, I want you to think about your friends and family members who are really good storytellers, right? It's entertaining when they tell you a story. They could be an actuary, and they could be telling you about how they calculated the lifespan of a coal miner in Pittsburgh, which actuaries make accountants look super exciting and interesting. So that's always funny to me, but it doesn't matter. The content almost doesn't matter, guys. The person's ability to tell a story is so much more important. And we all have friends and family members that are really good storytellers. And we also have family members that when they start into that story and you're just like, okay, number one, I've heard this story 17 times before. And number two, it's just not that good of a story. It's really boring. So in your flow, in your telling of stories, practice them. Make sure that they're interesting and compelling stories, right? That's how you sound not so robotic and not so rehearsed. Even if we tell you practice and prepare, but you're not rehearsing lines, you're repeating stories that this is an old story I've told dozens of times before, but it's a story, not a script. Does that make sense? Good question, though. Any other questions at all? Paula, good question. How long should you talk about yourself? I'm worried that I will talk too much instead of explaining why I'm interested. That practice is one of them. Practice repeating these stories. And yeah, probably if you go longer than like a minute or two, yeah, really rein it in. Probably about a minute is probably good. Now, full disclosure, I am guilty of this as well. I'm aware of that. But part of it is practicing, keep the answer to about a minute or so. And you can feel if your answers are too short or too long. But yeah, probably 30 seconds to a minute, depending on the question, right? But yeah, practice cutting yourself off so you know what it feels like to time it, to get the length on what you were trying to say so you don't rambling is absolutely a bad thing to do in an interview. Highly recommend not doing it. But it takes practice. Before, practice with your sister or your brother or your aunt or uncle, your family members, or your part-time job. Practice with that person for like 30 seconds. Have them ask you a question and practice. The other one that was really good for me when I was younger, if any of you have part-time jobs at like a restaurant or whatever, you can practice with customers. Have them tell you a little bit about themselves, right? Practice telling them a story, a short one, right? A 20 or 30-second story. You don't want to keep them there for a minute or two, right? Practice is probably the best way I would say in trying to do that. But yeah, that's a good concern. Anyone else? All right. If no one else has any questions, then I think Carlos and I may take off and let you guys out for lunch. Sound good?
Yep. Thank you
Thank
so
you, guys.